The entire argument on this head is sometimes evaded by the remark that there are temptations attending the reception of money through whatever channel it comes. But could this allegation be admitted as satisfactory, it might be employed in the defense of many evil things. There are temptations in the house of God as well as in the playhouse, yet we hold it right to frequent the church, but unwarrantable to frequent the theater. There may be dangers connected with partnership in trade, even where a partner is of unblemished reputation, but that would be no good reason for forming a partnership with a man known to be fraudulent and deceitful. Sometimes the argument is met by the indignant demand whether there are no ministers supported in the manner here condemned, as much distinguished for faithfulness as any others. But neither is this at all satisfactory. The argument respects the ordinary effect of such an alliance, not on particular individuals, but on large numbers, and not for a few years merely, but during a long course of time. There was an Obadiah in the court of Ahab, a Nicodemus in the Jewish Sanhedrin, and a Judge Hale on the bench in the days of Charles II. But this by no means proved that the position of any one of these eminent persons was favorable to integrity or virtue. Fifthly, in a community greatly divided in religious sentiment, an alliance between the church and the government opens the way for unprincipled rulers to patronize and support the most corrupt churches. Were an enlightened regard to the glory of God and the eternal interests of men the high principles by which civil rulers were induced to extend favor and support to the church, this support would be granted to those churches only by which the interests of true religion could be effectually promoted. But when state support is bestowed by rulers not on religious but on political grounds, the difference between true and false religion will be wholly disregarded. Should it so happen that true religion actually possesses political influence, then statesmen must make a virtue of necessity. And although they should hate it as Ahab did Micaiah, they must nevertheless make an effort to conciliate it, and therefore endowments will be given if the parties who ask them have political influence to give weight to their demand. If they cannot be conciliated, they may at least be quieted. For the very same reason, and by the same means must the professors of false religion be conciliated or their hostility disarmed. When power is the divinity and political expedience the supreme law, it matters nothing about the character of the religion which demands support, whether it be true or false. The great question is, what political influence can it command? This is the only consideration in determining both the grant and the amount. In the case of such rulers, the true reasons for granting support to a church are, quote, far above, out of their sight. The blasphemies of Rome, or the sublime imaginations of Brema, may as really meet their views, and as effectually serve their purposes, as the gospel of Christ. But we need not dwell on a hypothetical case. The flagrant iniquity of propagating false religion by grants from the public treasury is practiced in our own country to an enormous extent, and must justly be reckoned one of our great national sins. And what is especially to be lamented is that from the absence of any strenuous opposition or marked protest against the evil by any of our established churches, the government of the country can scarcely be aware that it is regarded by them as sinful. Truth and error are diametrically opposed to each other, as wholesome food is opposed to poison. Is opposed to poison. We could not but execrate the father who, when his children ask bread, gives them a stone, but when they ask a fish, gives them a serpent. But the case before us is infinitely worse. It is the immortal soul that is poisoned and destroyed by error. It may possibly be said that the parties who prefer the error will obtain it, whether the government provide it or not. To this we reply that the supposition contradicts the very ground on which government assistance is craved, that is, that the parties wish to propagate their principles more extensively by means of the assistance of government than they are able to do without the assistance, and secondly, it proceeds on the assumption that if the people wish for error, the government may, without sin, provide it for them. If the people choose to poison themselves, the government may supply depositories at the public expense from which they may be supplied gratuitously or at reduced prices. Thirdly, error provided and paid for by the government of a country is more dangerous and formidable than when sought for by the people themselves, as it then comes with the stamp and signature of public authority. And fourthly, What is done by government in such a matter involves the entire nation in the awful responsibility of the measure, those who accepted, who do everything in their power to prevent it. Those only accepted, who do everything in their power to prevent it. The establishment of different or opposite systems of religion in the same empire is at once wicked and absurd. If presbytery be right, prelacy is wrong. And on the contrary, if prelacy be right, presbytery must be wrong. If Protestantism be right, popery must be wrong. Or if popery be right, Protestantism must be wrong. They cannot be right on both sides. If the British sovereign believes prelacy to be right, how sinful to oblige him or her. To swear to support Presbyterianism and popery, systems opposed to each other, and both of them he believes to be wrong. In the British Parliament, Scottish Presbyterians sit down with Episcopalians and assist them in establishing or maintaining prelacy, and Episcopalians unite with Presbyterians in establishing or maintaining Presbyterianism. And then both classes of Protestants sit down together and establish or endow popery in the colonies and appropriate the goodly sum of £9,000 per annum to the support of the Popish College at Maynooth. Nor is this done of late years merely. The same monstrous wickedness was perpetuated when the British Parliament consisted exclusively of professed Protestants, and when each member of the legislature was required to take a solemn oath that popery was blasphemous and idolatrous. Can anything be conceived more absurd than for the government to pay one class of men for propagating truth and another class of men for propagating error? To pay one class of men for building up a system and another for pulling it down? To pay one class of men for laboring to establish the Protestant system in Ireland and another for subverting it? To pay one class of men for preaching salvation through faith in the divinity and atoning blood of Christ, and another class of men to preaching down the atonement and divinity of Christ? To pay one class of teachers for endeavoring to save, and another for destroying the souls of men? Truth sanctifies and makes men moral, but error demoralizes and destroys. To pay men for teaching error is to pay them for demoralizing and destroying a nation. It is setting the seal of national authority to this monstrous absurdity that error and heresy, blasphemy and idolatry are as favorable to the prosperity of a nation and as profitable to the souls of men as the truth of the gospel. In so far, however, as we can perceive, the union at present subsisting between the civil government and the churches of these lands renders this result inevitable. No one party is strong enough to maintain its own church revenues, which are now generally acknowledged to be public property, without purchasing the forbearance of other parties by a base and sinful silence, while they make good their claims to a share in the favor of government. Individuals may declaim in private against the expenditure of the public revenue for the support and diffusion of popish superstition and the blasphemous doctrines of Socinianism, but the stoutest opponents of these systems, belonging themselves to a state-supported church, find their tongue to cleave to the roof of their mouth in the National Assembly when increasing grants are annually appropriated to heretical and idolatrous churches. With what color of reason and consistency could the members of the established churches offer resistance to these grants? We are aware, it may be pled, that truth has rights and that error has none, that true religion deserves to be supported, but that false religion cannot be supported without heinous sin. But while the correctness of this statement is fully admitted, it may still be asked of what weight or utility it can be in assembly constituted as is the British House of Commons. You might bind Samson with a thread of gossamer sooner than control that assembly by an argument of such a texture. And besides, the established and endowed churches have disabled and neutralized this argument insofar as it could be urged on their behalf by their mutual consent to establish and endow one another. Were the question of a general endowment to the Romish clergy in Ireland debated in Parliament, and a member of the Episcopal Church should object to the proposal on the ground that popery being a corrupt and wicked system it was not entitled to support, the Roman Catholic could readily retort, quote, "You have established and endowed Presbyterian churches which you do not recognize as churches of Christ at all, which in very important matters are more remote from your sentiments than the Church of Rome. For if one of our priests joins your church, you recognize him without his being reordained. You acknowledge the validity of our ordination. But if a Presbyterian minister joins your church, you insist that he shall be ordained anew," unquote. Should some member of Parliament connected with the Church of Scotland oppose the grant on similar grounds, it would probably be replied, quote, "You have solemnly consented to the establishment of prelacy, when your forefathers pronounced anti-Christian, which your forefathers pronounced anti-Christian, and were sworn to extirpate, and the Pueism of which, at the present day, is at least as remote from your views of orthodoxy as the semi-popery of Archbishop Laud at the time of the Solemn League. You agree, moreover, that the Arian Synod in Ireland and the Remonstrant Synod and the Southern Association should be endowed from the public treasury, although you know that all these sects deny the supreme divinity of the Lord Jesus Christ, which the Roman Catholics acknowledge, and although they deride that atonement which you believe to be the only sure foundation of hope for eternity." Unquote.